Hi again, welcome back to the Introduction to Photography. This is lesson 3. We're going to be talking about how to get the most out of your point-and-shoot digital camera today, and we'll be addressing some of the different techniques and methods that you can use in order to get the best pictures out of your camera, in order to really take advantage of the features that are available in your camera. So thanks everybody for joining us here at the house and online. I'm glad you're here. And before we get started, anybody have any questions from the lesson last week on composition? No? Okay, that's fine. I'm certainly happy to just move on. Okay, so we're going to start out with a summary of what we talked about last week, the 10 rules that I came up with of composition. Okay? All right, as we go through, I'm going to have you guys just shout out what each rule is and how you can use it. So first rule, KISS. Anybody who watched remember what KISS means?
Keep it simple, stupid.
Yes, and by keep it simple, stupid, what do we mean? Anybody?
Well, sometimes when you're taking like a portrait or something, you try to have cool things in the background or try to do all these funky things, and sometimes it just makes it worse than it really is. If you keep it a simple photo, it's something that's elegant too.
Yeah, simplicity is usually the best thing when you're taking pictures, making sure that you don't have distracting things in your background and things like that. Okay. All right, so the next principle we talked about was location, location, location. Anybody care to share what that means?
It has to do with where you take the picture from, like the distance and what angles you take it from.
Definitely, yeah, finding a new angle to take your pictures from, kneeling down on the ground or climbing up to a new vantage to get a better shot. So, yeah, changing your location to get a better picture. Okay, next rule is the rule of thirds. Anyone want to take a stab at that one?
Well, basically, if you draw 2 lines down the screen in both directions, you've got a grid there. And if you are able to place your primary focus on one of those points, it makes the picture look more natural, I guess, and has some flow, not as static. Right.
Yeah, we found that if you take pictures where the subject is directly in the center, that it's not nearly as interesting. And we've known for a long time through things like the golden mean that putting subjects on one of the third lines, if you draw a tic-tac-toe grid, makes a much more interesting picture. Okay? All right, so next principle we talked about was I just need some space. Anybody remember what that one was? Anybody want to take a stab?
Nose room. If you're there facing this direction, you want to give some space on the picture this side, not as much on the back of their head. Right. For instance.
Yeah. It helps to tell the story a little bit better. You can see where somebody is heading, what they're looking at, that kind of thing. Okay? Perfect. Okay, now, next one, scale. Anybody want to take a stab at that one? No? Nobody?
Don't have a huge face.
Yeah. The thing I defined with scale was that when you're taking a picture of something that's really big or really small, you put something else in the picture in order to emphasize the actual size of the thing you're taking a picture of. Because a photo is two-dimensional, you can't really tell just by looking at it.
Sometimes if you put like a hand or something in there, it gives you a little bit more perception.
Yeah, all you have to do is put something in the picture that gives a frame of reference. So that people can understand just how big or small something is.
It is important, though. I remember there's that one picture you show where there's like it was like arches. There's some guy in the picture, but he was so far away, you really couldn't even see him at first. So I think it's important that the object be at least big enough you can tell him.
Yeah, definitely.
See that it's there.
That wasn't a great example, but it's the only one I found quickly. Just scanning through my photos, where I had something that was big and something small in the same photo. Okay. All right. So that's scale. All right, layers of depth and texture. And I know there was a lot of information there, but anybody care to summarize what we talked about with that?
Talked about having a foreground, middle ground, and a background.
Yeah, that's definitely a part of having layers in your photograph. Not necessarily a principle you need to apply to every picture, but it certainly does add a three-dimensional aspect to it. Okay. And then there's this texture side of things too. Anybody? Anyone? Bueller?
Bueller.
Okay, with texture, I just talked about how if you have a repeating texture that starts in the front of the photograph and moves backwards, your eye automatically knows that because of the repeating pattern that there's a change in size and change in depth. And then also by side lighting something with the texture, you can get the sense of 3 dimension as well. So this is our principle of getting 3 dimensions into a picture. Okay, leading lines. This is an easy one. What are leading lines?
You have a bunch of lines that kind of point to the subject or at least draw your attention in a certain direction.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. Any sort of lines in the picture, whether it be real lines or differences in color or contrast, anything that kind of draws some sort of line to lead your eye into the real center of attention in the photograph. Okay, perfect. Okay, and then shapes, very similar to lines. Come on, guys. You got people watching. Okay, basically with shapes is like anything made up of lines, circles, square, triangles, squares, etc. We talked about how triangles, equilateral triangles, make some of the nicest looking shapes. Okay? All right, so moving on to balance. What was balance?
Basically, in an image, you've got, well, obviously different objects in it, and it's best if you can compose it such that when you look at it, it feels balanced. So if there's somebody on one side, there's something on the other side, hopefully that'll balance it slightly.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And it could be one big object and several smaller objects.
Right, and just have something in the picture to kind of make it so that a picture isn't imbalanced. You don't have too much on one side, not enough on another. So, yeah, exactly. Okay? And then our last one was color. And we're going to focus more on this one next week. But the principle here was what? Dustin, you haven't spoken up yet.
Sure. Color was, I guess, is kind of like balance, like using complementary colors to make the picture more interesting. So there's more things to look at, and it's a better picture just by using different kinds of colors, either like opposing colors or next to each other or whatever. So.
Yeah, using different color schemes in order to make a picture more interesting, make things stand out. Okay. All right. So there's our summary of last week. Once again, any questions? Okay. All right. So now we'll get into what we're going to talk about today, and that's going to be how to get the most out of our little point-and-shoot digital cameras. And I'm going to be demonstrating primarily from my little Nikon here. If we get a shot of that one. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so my little Nikon. And then I will also be getting out my Canon. So we'll get a couple of different manufacturers here and see how they do their menus and see how you accomplish different things with those. And then we'll actually talk to some of the people that are here and figure out how to do some of these principles on their cameras as well. Okay, so we're going to talk about the common camera modes that we're going to be encountering on different cameras. Okay, and this is kind of the basis of making the most of the camera that you have. Okay, so the first camera mode that we often have is called portrait mode, and that's exactly what it sounds for. It's like for taking people's pictures, their portraits. And there's other ways to use that. We'll cover that here in a minute. You can take advantage of some of the things that the camera does when you put it in portrait mode in order to get other looks for your photographs, for other types of photographs. Okay, next one we have is landscape. And once again, that's for taking pictures of landscapes and scenery types of pictures, that kind of thing. Okay, then we've got a sports mode for taking action shots. And the other one we're going to cover is going to be macro or close-up mode and what all those different things do. Okay? Alright, so let's go ahead and go right into portrait mode. Okay, so this here is the instructions in the manual for my Nikon camera and tells what the portrait mode is used for. It says, helps you frame portraits in which the main subject stands out clearly while background details are softened. This lends the composition a sense of depth. The degree of softening depends on the amount of light available. A nice typo there, by the way. But what does that sound like to you guys? Some of the parts of that definition. Some of the principles we've talked about.
Field of view, like using the depth of field using the aperture and the f-stop to adjust that.
Yeah, definitely so. Okay. All right. And along with that, so we've got the minimum depth of field and a large aperture, which is the small f number. And then another thing about this mode is that the flash mode can usually be selected. On a lot of these cameras, when you put them in these special modes, they might turn the flash on or off automatically for you, and you don't have any control over it. But fortunately, in the portrait mode, you can turn the flash on and off manually. Okay? All right. So I'm going to go ahead and hook up this little camera. And let's see, which way does this go? There we go. I'll go over a couple different things in the portrait mode. There we go. And let you guys see it too. Okay, so I'm going to go into the portrait mode on this camera. Okay, and we'll use these guys over here as our subjects. Alright, this particular model has a couple of pretty nifty features, where you can not only have a standard portrait mode, but it's got some templates, where you can tell it that you want to have your subject on the left, on the right, in the middle, and here we go, we'll do a portrait of a couple. And you two guys get to be a couple here for a minute.
Wonderful.
So here's the camera is using this guideline to help know how to focus and get the proper lighting and so forth. And when you take the picture, it uses that information. Okay? So there's our picture. Okay? Alright, so that's kind of the basics of the portrait mode. We talked a minute ago about how it allows a minimum depth of field. So in addition to allowing you to take pictures, you can use it anytime you want to have a shallow depth of field in your pictures. Okay? Alright. Not the right source. Here we go. Okay. Alright, so that's portrait mode. Can you guys think of any other potential uses for a mode like that? When else would you want to have a shallow depth of field?
Maybe if you're taking a picture of a flower or something that's really close like that, something that's an intimate photo. So it's not always a person, but it could be something that you want to be personified or have that animation.
Definitely. Yeah, and that's a great way to use the portrait mode on a camera. Is anytime you want to have that intimate feeling with the subject. So if you want that minimum depth of field, your camera usually has a portrait mode that you can use in order to get that. And a lot of these small cameras, like this one in particular, it doesn't actually have a way of manually adjusting the aperture in order to get that shallow depth of field, large aperture. So what you have to do is you have to go into the portrait mode in order to get that setting. Okay? So that's just one way you can use the portrait mode there. Okay? Alright, so we'll move over to the landscape mode. Alright, here's the landscape mode. So we'll talk about it here for a second. Okay, and the instructions manual for this camera says it helps you frame vivid landscape shots that enhance outlines, colors, and contrast. So some of those principles we haven't talked about, but I know you guys know some of them, so let's just go ahead and talk about them anyway. So what sort of things are going on internally in the camera when you select the landscape mode, according to this description?
Well, what I was just thinking is, generally if you're going to be taking a picture outside, it's going to be daylight, especially landscape. So the ISO is going to be lower, or ISO. As far as colors go, I'm not sure what setting directly they'd be messing with there.
Okay.
That we've talked about.
Yeah, we haven't talked about it yet. This is something we're going to cover in more depth next week.
Like saturation?
It's saturation.
I always do that on the computer, but I guess the camera could do that.
Yeah, a lot of people don't bother to edit their photos on the computer, so if you have a setting on the camera that allows you to make the colors really pop, and that's the saturation setting, then you can certainly use that. And as mentioned in the description here, the landscape mode is using that in order to enhance the colors, according to the definition they've got here. Anything else? There's actually two other things going on here that I can see.
Well, the f-stop's going to be, the f number's going to be high, so they can have a larger depth of field and get trees in the foreground and mountains in the background all in focus.
Right. Yeah, you've got a lot of stuff you want to include in your picture, so you'd be going with a shallow or I'm sorry, a large depth of field, a small aperture. What were you going to say, Dustin?
I was going to say the exact same thing.
Okay.
So.
All right. And so that's actually in my notes. It gives you, the landscape mode gives you the large depth of field. It gives you a small aperture, which is the large f number. It applies some image sharpening in order to make edges on objects stand out a little bit more. Increases the contrast so that blacks are more black and whites are more white. And in most cases, the flash in this mode should be disabled. Why would that be? Why do we want to disable the mode, the flash in the landscape mode?
There's no way that the little flash on there is going to reach the mountainside, so it's kind of pointless to even do it because it would probably make more noise and whatnot.
Right.
The other thing is too is the flash generally means the camera makes the shutter faster because of the flash, and the mountains and background will be dark.
Very good. Yeah, I mentioned that last week when we did a review. So yeah, first of all, the flash isn't going to reach. There's no way it's going to reach the faraway objects, and because of the flashes on, the camera is going to be selecting certain settings, certain shutter speed and whatnot, and that can mess you up when you're trying to take a landscape type of photo. Okay. You guys have all been or seen on TV football games and whatnot where you see a million flashes going off in the stands. How many of those pictures do you think actually come out? Probably about none of them. So if you're taking a picture in that sort of situation where your subject is far away, you can use the landscape mode on your camera. Okay? Alright, so we've covered all of that, and I'll just go into the landscape mode on the camera here. And okay. Yeah, Dustin.
I have a quick question.
Uh-huh.
If say you're using a film camera,
Uh-huh.
how would you change the saturation, or is that something that's going to be covered?
On film camera, the only way to do saturation is to go with a different film.
Okay.
So that's something that is film dependent on the film camera. So yeah, that'll be part of the color discussion next week. Okay. All right. So we'll go back to our video. So you guys here in the front, you'll be our landscape. All right. We'll go into our menu. This Nikon cameras in particular have these different settings. So scenic view, that's where you have mountains and so forth, and it helps you to compose. And if you notice at the little graphic there, where those yellow lines happen to fall within the photograph, they fall on the rule of thirds. And then if we go down here to architecture, once again, what do we see going on there? Rule of thirds, and we've got the diagonal lines from corner to corner. So it helps you, the camera just helps you to frame a better picture. Okay? Then we've also got these other settings of group right and group left. And basically these are combinations of the landscape and portrait modes. The camera kind of comes up with a happy medium between all the different settings in order to get the picture that you want. So that's just a couple examples there. Okay? Any questions about landscape? Where else would you might want to use landscape besides taking landscape pictures? Think of any other situations? Yeah.
I mean, anything where you're kind of shooting something that's really far away, large depth of field.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a big, I don't know, like a graduation or something, where you're taking a picture of like the whole audience, or like you kind of said, like the football field, if you're trying to get an aerial view, or something from a large vantage point or something like that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Anytime when you've got subjects both close and far away, the landscape mode is a good mode to use for that. Okay. All right. Let's see. One other point I was going to cover, and it's just slipped my mind. Anyway, I'll come back to it. Okay. So that's it for landscape. Then we'll go ahead and move into. Oh, that's not the right one. I think I lost it. Yeah, I did. Okay. I had the one for sports mode, so we'll just have to talk about this. Sports mode. What would you think a sports mode on a camera would do? What sort of settings?
Increase the shutter speed, so there's less blurring, fast motion.
Nice fast shutter speed. Yep.
And because of that, the aperture is going to have to be larger too. The opening's larger, the f number's lower.
Right.
In fact, sports photos are often blurry in the background, and they like that because it isolates the person they're taking a picture of. So that's one reason. The ISO is going to be really high too.
We also talked about how on a lot of the cameras that sports photographers use, they use those absolutely huge lenses, so they can have the huge apertures, so that they can get the fast shutter speeds from a distance.
I was going to say, with a small camera like that, you're probably not going to get too great of a shot on the But I guess what they'll do is probably just optimize what it can do. And
Right, exactly. If you're taking pictures outdoors, you've got a lot of light coming from the sun, and so to some degree you can have the fast shutter speed and still be able to get the picture that you want. So, let me pull up the manual on this thing real quick. Maybe I can recreate my slide. So, by the way, anybody watching at home, if you have a question, feel free to email it in. The address is photoclass@maxoutput.com, and I will be checking email and answering questions. Okay, so just bear with me 1 second, and I will find the sports mode. Not passports. So I wanted to cover this because there's a couple other things that it mentions. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, basically, okay. All it's saying here is that mode is used for dynamic action shots that capture moving objects. Okay. So that's a basic idea with the sports mode. So unfortunately, I didn't have the slide for that. Other situations where you might use the sports mode. Fast shutter speed.
The light condition. No, never mind.
You could. You really could. Yeah. If you've got a lot of light, you can use the sports mode to get a fast shutter speed and cut the amount of light coming down into the camera. So if you think internally, anytime you select the sports mode, it means fast shutter. That means less light coming into the camera. So, yeah.
Maybe if you're taking a picture out of a window and driving by in the car real fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anytime there's a lot of motion, if you have to move your camera a lot, that's another good situation where your subject is going to be moving relative to you. The sports mode is a great way to help capture that without being blurry. Okay? Any other ideas? No? Okay, that's okay. That's not a mode I use much, so I'm certainly happy to not talk about it a lot. Okay, and the last one we're going to cover here in much detail at all is the macro or close-up mode. Okay, it's used to capture vivid colors in close-up shots of flowers, insects, and other small objects with a background artistically blurred. Sounds a lot like what?
Portrait.
Sounds a lot like portrait, doesn't it? The difference here is, well, first of all, it increases the color saturation, and on most cameras it'll also enable a close focusing mode so that you can actually focus on objects that are really close to the lens. And normally lenses, when they're not in macro mode, are only able to focus on objects that are a certain distance away and farther. And you turn on the macro mode, and that allows you to go quite a bit farther. So, and then on the bottom here, I've noticed that the exact function varies by camera, because just within the 3 cameras that I've got here on my desk, the function of the macro mode is completely different. So on the Canon here, the macro mode definitely only focuses on close objects, whereas on the Nikon, it doesn't adjust the focusing at all. So you have to read the manual and really find out what's going on. So, yeah, Jonathan.
And I don't know if you know this, but like, how is it that they are able to get like a super close focus like that? Because I've seen that with my video camera before. It has like a thing where when I do come in really close and it all of a sudden changes something and it's focusing on something like ridiculously close.
Right. I don't know specifically what's going on in there, but I know that it actually involves zooming in and changing the way that the focus is calculated, essentially. So when I'm doing macro photography, instead of buying macro lenses, what I do is I use these little close-up filters that go on the end of a zoom lens, as long zoom lens at that. So I might use like a 300 millimeter lens, and I pop that close-up filter onto the end, and that change in focus because of the filter actually allows me to get in and focus on things closely. There's something going on inside the camera that's similar to that, I would guess, but I've never torn a camera apart to find out exactly what's going on there. Anybody happen to know? Okay. All right. Macro mode is usually represented on a camera by a little flower symbol. And unfortunately, I couldn't find one that was suitable for on-camera use, so you just have to remember that. Okay. And those who are here checking their cameras. It should be on there. Most of them have it.
Little flower.
Yeah, little flower. It's usually a little flower. Okay? Alright, now I'm just going to cover real quickly some other modes that some camera have. I got this off my Nikon's manual. And first of all, we've got the party indoor mode, which adjusts for room lighting color. We'll talk about lighting color in a minute, and gives a large depth of field. The beach snow setting increases exposure. We'll also talk about why that is here in a minute. Sunset increases color saturation and decreases the exposure. Dusk and dawn increases color saturation, gives longer shutter speeds. The night landscape is slow or long shutter speed. And then we've got museum, which turns off the flash. Fireworks, which focuses at infinity. And then backlit, which helps you to increase the exposure of your foreground subject to compensate for any backlight that might be coming from behind. So those are just a couple examples of some of the other settings that cameras have. Really the best way to find out what any given mode on your camera does is to read the manual. That's where I got the information from these. Like they're probably adjusting things that you don't know about. Like when I first researched the macro mode, I didn't realize that it adjusted the color saturation and sharpening and things like that. But it's good to know that. So when you're taking a picture, you can know, hey, I need the shallow depth of field, but I also want to increase the focus. I want to have a sharper picture. Then you use the macro mode versus the portrait mode. So that's a good way to do that is to read the manual. Okay, and then the other thing we wanted to cover here is a few other handy camera settings. Most cameras have these, and we'll cover these in more detail than some of the other stuff we talked about. And the first one here is exposure compensation. And what that means is shifting the exposure that the camera decides it wants to use so that you can get the exposure that you really want. Then we have white balance, which adjusts the color that the camera interprets as white. And then we've got several different flash modes that we'll talk about as well. Okay? Alright, so go right into exposure compensation. And I did find a picture of what this logo looks like, but it's going to take me a minute to find it. Anybody have any questions? I know that this lesson's a little drier than some of the other ones, but let's see, documents, photography class. Okay, a lot of pictures here to choose from. Symbol. Okay, maybe I don't have it. I know I found one. After all, okay, here we go. Nope, that's not it. Okay, there we go. It's absolutely huge. Excuse me. This is what the exposure compensation icon will look like on your camera. And like I mentioned before, this is what we use to adjust how much the camera exposes a given image. And let's see, go back to the definition here. When you take a picture with especially with a point-and-shoot camera, it tries to look at the scene that you're taking a picture of and decide what the proper exposure is based on the amount of light coming into the lens. And there are some scenes that are a little bit too confusing the camera can't handle well. Anything that's really bright or really dark, the camera will have a really hard time with. So we have bright scenes like a beach or in the snow. Those pictures actually tend to be underexposed, making the snow or beach look gray. And then we've got dark scenes such as nighttime shots, and you guys have all seen pictures that are taken at night where black is not black, it's actually showing up as gray. And it's because the camera is trying to overexpose. And the best thing that we can do to take care of that is use the exposure compensation feature on the camera. So I'll go back to my Nikon, and you won't be able to see it here, but there's a button just to the right, and you press it, and there's your exposure compensation. And you can shift it, and these numbers are what we call stops. We talked a little bit about stops in the first episode, but so you can see very clearly that as I'm adjusting this, it's actually adjusting the brightness of the image itself. If you're taking a picture in the snow, the camera thinks there's too much white here, so it decreases the exposure. So what you want to do is you come into your exposure compensation and you shift it up. You take a brighter image to compensate for it. And if you're taking a picture at night, the camera thinks I need more light, so it increases the exposure, and you come in here and you adjust it down in order to get the proper exposure. So that's exposure compensation. Okay? All right, and any questions so far? Yeah, Justin.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jonathan. Sorry.
That's all right. So sometimes, like you're saying, kind of like with the snow, the camera wants to automatically adjust it. But if you start moving it up, you're gonna overexpose, like that white from the snow.
Right.
Or you'll get, like, if you have a zebra button on your camera, if it's a nicer one, it'll show that it's too strong.
Right.
So what's that gonna end up doing, when you're pulling up on the computer?
Well, basically what happens is when you go to take a picture of snow, if the camera on its default settings, it's going to way underexpose everything, and you're going to end up with a gray snow. So you use the exposure compensation to try and get your snow back to white. So you boost up your exposure by a little bit. You might lose a little bit of details, but you'll actually end up with a photograph that looks better because you're properly exposing everything in the scene. Okay? Make sense? You follow? Okay, my favorite tool, I should mention this, my favorite tool for getting proper exposure is the gray card, and I recommend to everybody they buy a gray card. It's just a piece of cardboard, and it's gray, and I better move it out of the projector there. But this is what the camera interprets as the average light level in a scene. So if you take your camera and aim it at a gray card, it will know the proper exposure. And this even works with the little point and shoot cameras. You aim your camera at the card, press the button halfway down to get your your exposure and focus settings, and then you'll have the proper exposure on your image. So, yeah.
The one thing I was just thinking though is if you are taking a picture of somebody like 20 feet away,
you have them hold the gray card and try and zoom in as much as you can.
Try and zoom in, but if the camera only has like 3x optical zoom, which would be a typical point and shoot,
right?
The card's not big enough in the screen to compensate that much.
Right. Yeah, there's to be honest, there's not a whole lot you can do about that, except maybe walk up close. And for most average pictures, you won't need the gray card in order to get the proper exposure. It's only in scenes that are overly dark or overly light where having the gray card might be important. Yeah, Jonathan?
So the camera has like the halfway button, like you were just saying.
Right.
And you can set it, but then when you take a picture after that, you just have to hold it halfway down.
You have to hold it halfway down until you take it on most.
Move the card off the screen,
right,
and then snap, right?
Right, yeah. Unless it has...
Otherwise it's just going to wipe out what you just did. So.
Yeah, unless the camera happens to have a feature to lock the exposure, which something like an SLR will. The smaller cameras generally don't. However, this one does. So, I mean, it varies by model. If the camera has it, you look for a little asterisk on there, and pressing that asterisk button will capture the exposure, and then you can take the time that you need to focus and move around and get the gray card out of the scene, whatever you need to do. So some cameras have it, sometimes some don't. You'll find it more on your higher end cameras than you will on the lower end ones. So the gray card is a great tool for getting the right exposure on a camera. Okay, they're only a couple of bucks, and one of the other nice things is it's got instructions right on the back on how to use it. So they sell them at photography stores, and you just pick one up.
Now I've seen cards for white balance, and they're supposed to be true white. I guess you're going to be getting into that probably. But
yeah.
So this would be where you'd use it for exposure compensation.
Well, you can use this just to get the right exposure. If you use this, you don't need to use the exposure compensation feature on your camera.
Different topic than white balance, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, you can use this for white balance. I'll talk about that in a second. But getting the exposure off of a gray card will make sure that you get the proper exposure for your scene, no matter what the conditions might be: snow, beach, dark, whatever. Using the gray card will make sure that your camera gets the proper exposure. This is what it's looking for. It's looking for this amount of light coming in from the camera. And if you've got more than that, or you've got less than that, you have to use the exposure compensation in order to get the proper exposure on your pictures. So, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. So we've got the exposure compensation feature, and then we also got white balance that we'll talk about. And this seems to be a foreign concept for a lot of people who are new to photography. Basically, what white balance is a setting on the camera to make sure that it records colors properly based on the color of the lighting. And that might seem a little bit counterintuitive. You think, well, white's white, black's black. Well, maybe true, but lighting is all different colors. Different light sources emit different types of colors, and our eyes automatically adjust to the different lighting colors that are around us so that we don't notice that there's actually different colors of lighting. Okay? And a few examples. Compared to sunlight, indoor lighting, lamps and overhead lights and so forth, is very yellow. And you've probably all seen pictures taken indoor where the flash doesn't fire and it comes out very orange. And that's because of the incandescent lighting in the room being very yellow compared to sunlight that the camera is expecting. And also, compared to sunlight, fluorescent lighting is very green. Okay? And then compared to incandescent, sunlight is very blue. You've probably also seen pictures where it might be properly exposed for an indoor shot and you have light coming through a window and it looks very blue. And the reason for that is because the sunlight compared to incandescent is very blue. Computer monitors and TVs are also very blue compared to incandescent. In fact, anybody who's here who looks at my computer monitor probably thinks that looks very, very yellow. And what I've done is I've actually adjusted the color balance on the monitor so that it looks right on camera to match the lighting that we're using here. So you have to keep that in mind. And then also fluorescent is slightly blue compared to the incandescent lighting. Okay? So different lighting, different colors. And cameras have a white balance setting to compensate for that. And I'll go back to my Nikon again. See if we're still on. Okay. Alright, so on this camera, this is how we'll adjust the white balance. We go into the menu, and there it is. It's the second option on there. And then we've got a few presets. We've got an auto setting where the camera tries to guess, and then a white balance preset. And you notice as I adjust these that the image in the background is changing color pretty drastically. So here we've got the auto setting, and then here we go to a preset, and it looks very, very yellow. And then we've got a daylight setting. And if you look in the background here, you can see my blue desk actually looks yellow because the lighting that we're using here is incandescent, and it's very yellow compared to sunlight. So we've also got an incandescent setting. And what do you know? Our colors are correct when we select that. Okay? And we go to a fluorescent and shifts a little bit. And then the cloudy setting, lighting in cloudy conditions actually is slightly bluer than what you have in direct sunlight. So that's why you've got that setting. And shading and the speed light, which is flash. Flashes tend to be roughly the same color as the sun, but it can vary some. So there's our white balance setting. What sort of conditions do you think we might have where auto would not work for white balance? Anybody have any ideas? It's kind of related to exposure. We talked a minute ago about how exposure, if you're taking a picture of a scene that's mostly white, like snow, how the camera tries to compensate and make it darker. If we've got it set to auto on white balance, and we're taking a picture of something blue, what's going to happen? It's going to think that the blue is white, exactly. And so what happens then is you get the opposite color, which is the orange. So we need to adjust the white balance setting manually in that particular case. So if we're taking pictures indoors using incandescent lighting, we set it on the incandescent setting, and then all of a sudden the colors in our pictures are correct. Okay? Any of that make sense? I'll follow? Okay? Alright, and as Anthony mentioned before, one of the tools that we can use for getting the right white balance is, again, the gray card. So, focus your camera on there, set it to, you can set it to an auto setting, auto white balance setting, and frame on the white balance card, and it'll automatically record that color of gray as being the proper color, essentially, it's the right tone, and give you the right white balance in your picture. So,
Wait, so you use the gray card with the auto,
Mm-hmm.
and it's gonna realize that that's gray?
Yeah, it knows that this. Basically, it's looking for neutral colors.
Okay.
So if you put it on the auto setting and put it on a neutral color like a gray or a white, it says, okay, well that shouldn't have any color to it.
Right.
And so I know what the proper color of the lighting in the room is. So, makes sense. So, gray cards are a great thing to have. Only a couple of bucks. So, I carry one with my video camera and I carry one with my still camera. They help me get the right color in all my images. And one of the problems is, even if we have Photoshop and we try and fix the color in a picture that's wrong, we generally can't do it because it's a long, complicated explanation, but there isn't enough information in the picture in order to get the proper color if it doesn't have the right white balance setting from the time it was taken.
What about RAW? If you shoot RAW?
If you're shooting RAW, that's an entirely different case. It doesn't actually apply the white balance setting to the image. It's just recording the information directly off of the sensor.
But we're talking about point and shoot here.
Yeah, we're talking primarily about point and shoot here. And to be honest, some have RAW. This one has RAW capability on it. Yeah, it's a point and shoot camera, but it has a RAW capability. Right? Oh, okay. So, yeah, if your camera has a RAW setting, you don't really necessarily need to worry about white balance as much because you can set it when you're converting from RAW to whatever other format you're working with. When you bring it into Photoshop, you can actually select the white balance setting you want. So, okay. All right, and the last thing that I wanted to cover is going to be flash mode. Let's see, we'll get out of here. Okay. All right, so click on the little flash button here on the camera, and we get all these different settings. And if it stays, okay. Auto flash. Basically, what auto flash means there is that it's going to determine, on its own, whether you need the flash or not. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. The best way to go is to actually use a manual setting. This first one here, I have to keep moving in order to make it not go away. The first setting is red eye reduction. So it does the pre-fire flash, it does a smaller flash in order to get people's eyes used to the light, and then it takes the real picture. And then the second one is the no flash setting, where you might be taking a picture where you don't want the look of the flash, you don't want the deer in the headlights kind of look, so you turn off your flash. Of course, you have to make sure you have enough light in order to take the picture without flash. Then we've got the mode to just turn on the flash, and then this mode right here is a setting that allows you to take a picture using a flash and still expose everything else behind it properly. So if you're taking a picture of somebody outdoors and you want to be able to get the scenery behind them at night, that's the setting you would use for that. So those are just a few of the different flash modes that you might get in your camera. So, any questions with that? Okay, all right. I've got a couple of questions here. Okay, it says the question. This is Chris from Lehigh, Utah. It says, "Can you trust the camera's automatic white balance? Can you use a white card?" I kind of already covered that, but the camera's automatic white balance only works in scenes where it has something that's white or gray to focus on, and it can find it easily. So any other time you might use a white card or a gray card in order to find that white balance. So, okay. All right. Any other questions? So, we're nearing an hour here, so about the target time. But, anybody has any other questions, we can certainly ask them afterwards. Any web questions, feel free to email them in, and I'll email you back. Remember, that address is photoclass@maxoutput.com. And I had someone else ask if I'll be putting the class online. What happened was, the first one I did put online, second one I uploaded to Google Video. They rejected it. Tried again, rejected again, and then the third time, same thing. So I'm going to keep trying. I'll get it up online somehow. This class will be put up online as well. I'll have all 7 of them up online at some point, but it might be a while. But that's a good question. Thanks for asking that. If you guys have any questions that you want me to address in the next class, be sure and send those to photoclass@maxoutput.com as well. And I certainly appreciate you watching, and have a good time taking pictures. And if you got anything to share, be sure and let us know. Email it to us as well. So thanks a bunch. I'll see you next week.